Chapter 14. A Man Must Drink. I slipped back through the mangroves, emerged at the reef, and started at a run around the shore edge of the peak, jumping from boulder to boulder. It was to be war then. Charlie was out to get me, and I was out to live. Once around the peak, I was soon on the front shore of the reef again, skirting the lagoon. The tiny beach looked strangely familiar. And there stood the tent. Everything was the same, the tent door shut, the fire carefully banked up, the kerosene tin and 3 billies full of crystal clear water. Eagerly I drank. Since the parish during the king tides, we had always kept the billies full of water. With delight I found the spear. The feel of it on the hand brought surprising confidence. It was the work of a moment to seize the blankets and make a swag of the few personal belongings, and grasp a fire stick and fan it into flame. I passed the spear haft through the handles of 2 full billy cans, seized the handle of the kerosene tin bucket, and started back the way I'd come. When near the lagoon edge, just about to round the peak and well away from the camp, I paused for a breather and noticed something half buried in the shingle above high tide. It proved to be the log of the Seafoam, the old Malay's cutter. Very much the worse for wear, still it was readable, though most of it was in Malay. There were many empty leaves. It gave one a queer feeling to open the salted pages of this sea-wrecked relic and read it again, even though the contents were but short words of the sea, or accounts of the sale of bêche de mer, or orders on Chinese storekeepers for provisions. Eagerly I added this battered old sea log to the load. It would be something to read tonight. Then I hurried along, pausing now and then to whirl the fire stick and keep it well alight. Charlie would be very angry at the loss of the billy cans, but he would not need them. He had the whole well all to himself. Oddly enough, there were my own billy cans. I had bought them in Cooktown, and as an afterthought brought along the kerosene tin bucket as well. It was a hefty load, but the water was far more valuable than gold. The tide was now draining out, and it was possible to wade easily along the reef, though with many a backward glance. Thankfully I reached the mound. It is wonderful how adversity and the chance of more to come make a man think. Charlie would certainly visit me, if not almost immediately, on some future day when he was again in the grip of his trouble. If he came while I was in the mangroves fishing, he would find the water. He mustn't find the water. Craftily I found a hiding place down towards the sea edge, but above reach of the highest tide. A crevice in which the kerosene tin and billies fitted, as if the place had been chiseled out for them, and nearby a long flat stone like a board to cover the top. Sprinkled with sand, it looked perfectly natural. All around it was bare rock, so there was no chance of leaving a betraying track. Hurriedly throwing driftwood down into the cavern home, I climbed down and started a fire, rolling on logs that could not possibly burn out. Then, seizing the spear, I climbed up to the open sunlight, glanced back along the reef, lovingly balanced the spear, and dived into the mangroves, hungry and eager as any hunter. With an easy mind, too, independent now of everything. The tide was well out, the fishing excellent, and enhanced by the interest of exploratory work, for I avoided my usual haunts and pressed farther into the mangroves, locating several new creeks. The pools in this part of the island were different. The fish had to be detected in their varying hiding places. New mud holes had to be tested before a man dare plunge across them. Finding new creeks was going to bring new interest in the days to come, and there might be adventure any day in these labyrinths of shallow water and roots. I might come on a big old dugong left by the tide. Visions of a fat old sea cow brought a hungry gloating for fresh meat. The sea cow's plenteous steaks taste much like bacon, and a sea cow with calf would hold at least a kerosene tin full of milk. A few hours later, and I was back on top of the mound, picking the bones of 2 big cod, glancing every now and then back along the reef towards the peak. The last glance became an apprehensive gaze. 1,000 yards away by the foot of the peak and coming along the reef was Charlie. I tried to detect whether he was still in mad mood or coming to make it up. He approached rapidly and waved threatening arms. He wanted those billy cans and everything else I'd taken. I clambered down the mound and quickly carried up armfuls of decent-sized stones. This was my castle, and it now had to stand a siege. Charlie could remain within attacking distance only until the tide began to come in. He would be forced to retreat then. If I avoided him by slipping into the mangroves, then he could raid the camp, could do so repeatedly, and enjoy himself. No, he must keep to his side of the island, and I would keep to mine, with the tides between us, if he decided otherwise. Then he would learn that even with his pop gun he would not have much chance at a weary man amongst these boulders. Charlie, reaching the bottom of the mound, began to climb the boulders. In ambush I waited until I could see his glaring eyes, then let him have a barrage. He ducked and slipped, clutching as he rolled. A stone smashed into fragments beside his head, splattering his face with splinters. He must have been badly shaken, for he scrambled up and leapt back from boulder to boulder, followed by whizzing stones. When he gained the reef, he ran like something really mad. It was an unexpectedly easy victory. Time was to prove that when Charlie took these bad turns, a shock would jerk him back to normal. Lonely days went by. There was no sign of Charlie, though he surely must have recovered by now. It was impossible to see him unless he climbed the peak or came down by my side of the reef. He rarely did either. Tomorrow, when low tide came, I decided to walk along the reef and erect a flag of distress up on the lookout, and from there peep down on Charlie's camp. I had the depressing feeling that after one of his turns he might die, and I did not want the poor devil to die alone. That, I was to learn, was the very thing he wished to do. The sun was great company. With the dying of night, faint glows of light would seep down through the crevices, and the boulders would gradually take ghostly shape. One slender pillar was my lady in gray. When gathering light proved her to be only stone, I would arise over the sea, the sun would pop up, a glowing ball of red and gold balanced as if upon a hair line. The two unfriendly menfolk, the land birds and the sea birds, all brightened up with the coming of the sun. No doubt many species of the fish and crabs did too. With an occasional harsh croak, the gray and blue and white cranes would come down from their mangrove perches to alight by the mud holes. In stately fashion they would presently begin fishing for breakfast. The landward side of the mound grew perhaps 100 of the same hardy, dwarfed trees that clung to the sheltered side of the peak, and among these lived a few of the little yellowish-green birds whose comrades lived on the peak of the hill. With a lively twittering after sunrise, my birds would fly over the mangrove forest to the well. There they would drink and bathe and enjoy an hour's gossip with their comrades. Then they would return to the mound and go about their daily business. If it happened to be a hot midday, they would fly again to the well and indulge in a bath and chat with their cobbers. But if the day was cool, this second visit was made toward sunset for the evening drink and chatter. A few other birds kept to the gloom of the mangrove forest. These were seldom seen. They were very quiet and had the knack of disappearing like fleeting shadows. They reminded me of the fish that could stare within a foot of a man, but be invisible to him. In the mangroves, a man might suddenly, though only half-consciously, come eye to eye with such a bird, but in a second it would have disappeared behind a leaf. Sitting up on top of the mound, I used to watch and be watched by a colony of old and young cranes fishing around a large mud pool down at the base of the mound. It was on the landward side, just over the reef, a wide, shimmering pool as large as a couple of tennis courts, surrounded by mangroves. It had surprised me to find cranes on the island, but exploring trips to the heart of the mangroves revealed hidden pools and much wider creeks, each of which homed its cranes, quite solemn, wide-awake birds that shrewdly watched the approach of the strange man-animal while warily refusing to be flurried. I got to know every one of the cranes in the pool below me, the quaint actions of the long-legged bodies and solemn knowing heads, the hoarse peculiarity of each precocious voice. There was a white old patriarch with a bent bill and leery eye, a wise old chap with a quaint habit of turning his head sideways, as if saying, "Now watch me, young one, and I'll teach you something." Always close beside this old fellow was a lively little blue crane with a hoppy leg. Most likely, when a baby, his leg had been snapped at by a big fish, or a more awful eel. Among them all was the most solemn crane imaginable, a deep thinker. He would suddenly startle his companions by a series of hoarse calls, and they would energetically applaud in chorus. Idly I wondered why the birds never fished in the center of this pool, but always walked carefully around the outer edge. Perhaps the mud in the center was too treacherously sticky even to support the weight of a crane. Next day at low tide I walked along the reef, skirting the mangroves to the peak, climbed it, and from the top looked down at Charlie's camp. There was no sign of him. He was away fishing, doubtless. The peak was a far better lookout than the mound. It rose almost 200 feet straight up from the sea. From this height one could look upon a wide sweep of sparkling ocean, but there was no sign of sail or smoke. The mainland 15 miles away was visible now as a smudgy haze. How I longed to be on that mainland. No bird was caged more securely than we were. Charlie emerged from the lagoon mangroves. He was staring up as he walked across the open towards his camp. He bent over his banked-up fire. I longed to go down and make it up, but he might not have fully recovered. Perhaps it would be wiser to wait a few days. It would be wise, too, to fill the water buckets tomorrow and keep them always full in between Charlie's bad turns. I hurried back to the mound, intent on getting in my fishing before the tide turned. The tide regulated everything. Impossible to fish in the mangroves while the tide was in, and without lines one could not fish in the sea. When the tide was out, we could prowl all over the island, always remembering that we must hurry back when the tide turned. With the tide in, we were completely marooned to the peak or hill or mound. Next day I filled the kerosene tin bucket and billy cans, but saw no sign of Charlie. Several days later I waited near his camp, but he did not appear. Almost certainly he was watching from the mangroves, for I waited until the tide began coming in before hurrying back to the mound. The greatest weariness of this island was its tiny size. Apart from the mangrove forest, if a man could only have gone for long walks, it would have helped to pass time away. But when the tide was in, he was marooned on the few acres of land around the peak and the hill, as though he were sitting on a log upon the wide sea. Another fortnight passed, and peculiar weather came. The shadowy mainland was blotted out by storm clouds that traveled swiftly to engulf the island as billowing clouds of mist, shutting out the sea and sky and islands. 20 minutes later they would be swiftly blown away, and brilliant sunshine would momentarily show the mainland, with miles of sparkling waves in between. Then clouds and mist would quickly gather again and enfold all. Southward it was somewhat clear, the big bulk of Lizard Island standing up sheer and bold from a savage sea. Lizard Island was about 15 miles away. Often I wish that fate had landed us there instead of on this tiny speck. But there was no mangrove forest there, so we should not have had the fish and crabs to live upon. It came as a shock to realize that this forlorn hole had its compensations. On that much larger island we might have perished. Lizard Island, like so many others along the lonely peninsula coast, had known its tragedy. Miss Watson with her baby and the wounded Chinamen were driven from it by the blacks, who, waiting until the men folk sailed away, canoed across from the distant mainland to attack them. In the dead of night the woman, baby, and Chinaman crawled down to the beach from the hut, then, inch by inch, launched the half of a sawn-off iron tank and drifted away with it with the tide. It was a time of dead calm and blazing days. They drifted to this very island. The Chinamen crawled ashore right where Charlie's camp was now, crawled right around the peak, seeking water. The tragedy of it, that there should be water within easy reach, but hidden in the mangroves and the mud. Naturally, the Chinaman crawled back, shaking his head. Again they drifted for suffocating days in the iron tub, then stranded on the barren turtle group. The Chinaman was a gentleman. He crawled away because he did not want the Missy to see him die. She wrote in her diary until the last. Mist wreaths now blotted Lizard Island from view, and great black clouds came rushing from the mainland. Surely this weather would bring rain.